Good afternoon to those of you in South Africa and Europe, I suppose, or in Africa and Europe. Good evening to Professor Kumba Digdowiseiso who is in Jakarta. And good morning to Cibele Franzese, who is in Lima, I'm guessing, or I'm assuming in the Americas. It's a morning, good morning to you. So we have a tri-continental panel now on the question of fiscal decentralization. And we have a third panelist who will join us shortly. She's just struggling to connect from Brazil. But we will be looking at this important question, which is critical in South Africa. I think in the first debate this morning, Professor Yao Yang said that one of the critical success factors in the Chinese state, in the Chinese party state, has been fiscal decentralization. And there are two senses, he said, in which decentralization has been important to Chinese success. The first is that it has allowed for innovation and experimentation with different models of economic development and governance. But the second, which I think is more important for our discussion now, is that he said that the incentive structure of fiscal decentralization encouraged hard work on the part of local government authorities. And the thing that encouraged this hard work is that both expenditure and revenue mobilization were decentralized to the local level, and this encouraged hard work in China. 20 years ago or so, South Africa invented a new system of local government. It was, we hoped that it would be democratic, developmental, and people-centered. And so we designed an entirely new system based on the best practice in the world at that time. And I think we are now in a situation where that system faces, if not collapse, something very close to collapse, at least in a fiscal sense. So we have a local sphere of government which, at least outside of the cities, is increasingly looking as though it is in all-round operational and fiscal crisis. And so I suppose for South Africa, we're at a moment where we need to reconsider the constitution of fiscal decentralization. And that is why it's probably a very good moment to listen to the lessons of other countries in the global south that have experimented with fiscal decentralization and what have they learned from that. So I want to hand over there immediately to my first panelist, who is Professor Kumba Digdowiseiso. He's in Jakarta. He's the director of the Faculty of Economics and Business at the National University in Indonesia. And he has a passion for public finance, fiscal decentralization, and metrics of welfare and well-being. He holds a PhD from the International Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And he researches cross-cutting policy issues, including inequality in education and health, as well as the role of institutional quality in determining government outcomes. So over to you, Kumba, and we look forward to your input over the next 15 minutes.
All right, thanks, Michael. Good afternoon or evening, everyone. First of all, my utmost respect to Mr. Ivers and Mr. Rafael to organize these meetings, I think, and other panelists, for example, Professor Cibele as well as Professor Maria. It's been a pleasure to share a discussion with regards to fiscal decentralizations. Well, first of all, I don't have anything to share. So I'll let the discussion begin. So, well, I think the point that I would like to address at the moment is um, I would like to share to you guys about the process of local government formation in the nation, and then how the process of local government formations link to fiscal decentralization in Indonesia. So basically, when we talk about Indonesia, I think, as you know, that Indonesia decentralization projects began in 1999, and so far as it has been implemented through two major policies. The first one is regional autonomy. The second part will be the regional arrangements. So, in principle, regional autonomy is closely related to the degree of intergovernmental powers. Such autonomy, I think, is controlled the extent to which local government bodies are financially independent from the central governments. And this is the so-called fiscal autonomy. The second aspect is whether local governments have some sort of like a freedom to design and implement policies. And this is the so-called administrative autonomy. And the last one is the local government must have some sort of like authority to arrange local leadership successions. This is the so-called political autonomy. So meanwhile, as I told you before, regional arrangement can be viewed as a form of regional autonomy. Such arrangement in Indonesia contribute to two programs. The first one is proliferations. The second one is amalgamations. So these two programs play important roles in the creation of a new region in Indonesia. So as a result, new autonomous regions has a fiscal, administrative, and political autonomy, I think. So we have, we focus on the proliferation first. So as you know, proliferation is a condition in which like a province and or district or city split into two or more regions. So conversely, amalgamation is a condition in which two or more provinces or districts or cities are merged into one region. But in Indonesia, the latter event had those never occur in the context of Indonesia decentralization. So why? This is because the costs of amalgamation are higher or outweigh the benefits. For example, if you talk about the costs, it involves the number of public servants, which I think under our regulations stipulating the merging of public servant numbers. So increase heavily in merged regions. Uh, well, I think you mentioned like some politician or local leaders in the original regions and its parliament will immediately lose their job. So I think that process, amalgamation, never took place in Indonesia. I think if you compare to like European countries, for example, Sweden's and most Scandinavian countries, amalgamation is a very 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 content. I mean, like um, is occur in most Scandinavian countries, I think. So this will bring we have proliferation, amalgamation, but in Indonesia context, we only see the process of proliferation instead of amalgamations. And the second part I would like to address is implementation of fiscal decentralization in Indonesia. And I think if you look at the World Bank report, for example, the 2003 World Bank report gives some sort of like historical overview on the development decentralization system in Indonesia. So I think we began like, for example, like the Indonesian government has some sort of like implemented decentralization under the law of number one's year 1945. So, but at the time, the Dutch were I think, reluctant to give up their colonial possessions and started to, establish several Indonesian republics outside the Java Islands. For example, South Maluku republics. So this concept, I think, lasted for less than a years, and Indonesia reverted to unitary states. So the issue of decentralizations come to surface again in 1974, but under this law, decentralization was never been implemented properly until 1992. So in principle, under the law number 5, 1974, this law assigned for few affairs, and each region had to, prove that the central government that they were ready for conducting these affairs. So finally, we move forward to the economic crisis that took place around the world at the time in 1997, with some sort of like serial political and social instability in 1998. So as a part of I think government reforms at the time, the government of Indonesia was advised by the IMF and the World Bank to expedite this decentralization process. So I think in 1999, we have two law. The first one related to the local governments. The second one, we have the fiscal balance between the central government and local governments. These frame Indonesians' administrative and fiscal decentralization strategy. So after 2-year interlude for preparations, there has been some sort of like a considerable number of amendments for both laws. And I think with most affairs being devolved to the district levels, government expenditure has been, consequently shifting from a highly centralized, dominated by the central budget, to decentralized expenditures dominated by the district and provincial budgets. So that's the short history of implementation of decentralization in Indonesia. So before the 2001 decentralization, the intergovernmental fiscal transfer from central government to the provincial and district or city governments were made through a block grant concepts, where the largest component were the subsidies for autonomous region. We call it SDO, and the presidential instructions. We call it INPRES. Now, this one has some sort of like different characteristics in Indonesia. The SDO, on the one hand, was mostly used to finance salaries of civil servants in the regions and the region's other current expenditures. While on the other hand, I mean, like the impress constitute the spending for the development in the regions. The purpose of these two earmark grants look promising, I think, at the beginning, in which central governments seek to maintain low poverty and equality, and but somehow the grievance of resource-rich regions outside the Java Islands, such as Aceh, Riau, East Kalimantan, East Timor, and Papua, started to escalate since most of them are marginalized by central governments in terms of development. This is what we call in the conflict literature as justice-seeking motivations. It takes place when local population feel that they are not getting a fair return in revenue sharing of their natural resources, such as oil, gas, gold, coal, and copper. So moving on to 1998 to 1999, of the economic crisis led the collapse of those SDO and INPRES. So following the fall of the autocratic regime of Suharto under transition of administration of B.J. Habibie at the time in 1999, then followed by early reformist regime of Abdurrahman Wahid, the government in Indonesia at the time continue to implement some sort of like a decentralization in many aspects. In terms of fiscal decentralizations, I think at the time central governments, initiated the so-called spatial autonomy status to those resource-rich regions, which they initially thought as a fair share to dampen the conflict. So at the time, some of these regions choose to stay, while only East Timor, through referendum, decided to part the way. So in 2001, the government in Indonesia at the time then introduced a new concept of fiscal decentralization, or what we call as intergovernmental fiscal transfers. The first one is general allocation fund. The second one is specific allocation fund. And the third one is revenue share based on natural resources and tax revenue. So all of them are the component of the new intergovernmental fiscal transfer, or what we call as a balancing fund, which I think has been dominating sources up to now of the revenue of every district for many years. So on average, I think as we can see from the data, district governments' own revenue account for less than 10% of district total revenue. So from the 2002 decentralization, I think is widely regarded as one characterized by decentralization of expenditure, as opposed to decentralization of revenue. I think this come for following reason. The first one is the bulk of the, I think, district government spending is mostly financed by the balancing fund. And the second one is the district or cities government have, limited local taxing powers. So that's the brief history of implementation of fiscal decentralization in Indonesia. So I think for me, it's just a short discussion of how the process of fiscal decentralization in Indonesia. So I think it's compared to South Africa. I think we are less developed. If you look back at the moment, is we now have just focus on the spending decentralization instead of revenue raising capacity. Yeah. So the revenue raising capacity, I think, is very lack at the moment because it's very centralized. So the central government, setting the tax rate and so on. So that's hamper the local economic development in Indonesia. So I think that's my introductions. We'll get back to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Kumba. And now from Jakarta, let's cross the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean and go to Sao Paulo, where we have Cibele Franzese, who is she's a professor at the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. And she was Deputy Secretary of Public Management and Planning and Regional Development for the government of the state of Sao Paulo. And as I say, she's currently a professor at Getulio Vargas Foundation and coordinator of the Public Administration undergraduate course at the same institution. She teaches and researches in the areas of federalism, intergovernmental relations, and people management in the public sector. So welcome. A warm welcome to you and good morning to you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, Michael?
I hear you very well, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks to Rafael for the invitation. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk a little bit about Brazil. I hope our experience can help you to build a system with transfers and a decentralized system. I will talk a little bit about Brazilian system. I will ask you, please, to share my slides. I put some small points on the slide to help you to know a little bit about Brazilian system. Just some points about Brazilian context. The first thing is about our general context. So the main points are in our constitution. Our constitution is from 1988, and we are a federation. So it's a point to consider, which touches in the main points that Kumba started talking about: the autonomy to spend money, the autonomy to decide where to spend your money. This is very important because when you are a federation, you have this political autonomy and this fiscal autonomy respected. In Brazil, we are a 3-level federation, so the municipalities are also a federal level. We have 26 states and the federal district, and 5,570 municipalities. We have mandatory federal transfers to local government because we are a very unequal country. We have the Southeast and the South are the richer states, and we need to redistribute the income that the taxes that we receive, mainly the income taxes. So a little bit more than 22% of federal taxes go to a municipalities fund, and 21.5% of the income taxes go to a state fund. So it's a redistribution of the main of the income tax that the federal level collect to redistribute this tax that is not the main tax we have in the country. The main tax we have in the country is the VAT that is collected by the state level. Okay, so the income tax is collected by the federal level and is redistributed to municipalities and to states by the municipalities fund and the states fund. And municipalities collect these transfers by is proportional to the number of its inhabitants. And states fund and states collect the money from its fund, this states fund by also the number proportional to the number of its inhabitants. And the Constitution also establishes that social rights should be guaranteed by social policies that would be provided by the 3 levels of governments. They should work together to provide health, basic education, social security, housing, and lots of other social rights. So the Constitution established shared responsibilities. This is a tricky question. This is a tricky question, what we could call a wicked problem, because you have shared policies, shared responsibility, and difficult accountability, because 3 levels of government should do together a policy framework that were poorly designed, because one citizen doesn't know who is accountable for health who is properly accountable for education and who is properly accountable for social care, because Constitution says that 3 levels of government are responsible to provide that kind of policy. Okay, so what happened after the Constitution? What happened is that each level of government made what we call in the federal literature the blame avoidance policy. They said, okay, you should, as a citizen, you should ask for federal help. You should ask for municipality help. You should ask for state help. It's not my fault. And citizen had no education and no health and no social care, no proper social care. And we needed what we called in Brazil federal coordination to have social provision. What we had in the 90s was a process of fiscal decentralization linked to social policy. So I would ask you to change the slide. Thank you very much. We had fiscal decentralization linked to health, social care, and education. In health, we had federal transfers linked to new municipal offer to free public services integrated to national health service. So federal level said, municipalities, if you create a new service in health, a new basic service in health, I transfer you a new kind of money, a new kind of transference, but you have to create a new service in health. All the majors thought, okay, I will create a new service, which is very popular, and I will create a new basic service, and I will be part of the national health service, a national public health service. And municipalities started creating basic services in health. They were incentivized by the new federal transfer. Considering that incentives, this new federal transfer incentives, municipalities started creating basic health services all throughout the country, and we were very successful in implementing basic services in health, and now we have universal access to basic health services in Brazil. When municipalities did that, they created new service, but the money that the federal government gave didn't cover all the needs that municipality had. So the municipalities had to start expending their own money and assumed the new service. So the municipalities started spending their own money on health and assumed the new health services. And this meant that decentralization actually happened. Decentralization of health services and decentralization of public spending. It happened in health, and it happened also in social care. 20 years later, social care actually copied the same model of health with the federal level giving transfer incentives to the municipalities, building social care, basic social care equipments, public equipment, in exchange of federal transfers. The municipalities had the same attitude. They started building the basic services, and now in Brazil we have what we called basic social care services for every citizen, and municipalities also assumed the service with their own spending, with their own budget. In health, in education, we had a different behavior, because in education, states and municipalities have responsibility for education. What we had is that we had a constitutional amendment that obliged states and municipalities to transfer their part of their income to this fund, and this fund would be a part of this fund would be redistributed between states and municipalities to students. Let me start to explain again. States and municipalities would transfer part of their taxes to a common fund that would be redistributed between them, considering the number of students that are enrolled in state schools and municipality schools. Okay, so the money would be redistributed considering the number of students enrolled in state schools and municipality schools. And federal money would be only to compensate inequalities. So federal money would come only to complement the money to make less unequal state and municipal money that would be, because Brazil is a very unequal country, so we have states that have a per capita a per capita that is less than other states. So federal money would be only to complement different per capitas in the country. With these policies, we could again make universal all the access to basic education in Brazil. So the point I want to make here is not to explain in details the policies in Brazil, but just to say that the way we could make the policies to be implemented and the money to be really decentralized is to link money to policy, to link the transfers to the real implementation to policy in Brazil. So all the fiscal literature says that when the federal level decentralizes money to local governments, what happens? The local level does not spend the money with responsibility, because when the money comes easy, the money is spent with not good responsibility. What we saw in Brazil is when we received money linked to policies, the money is spent properly, and what else? The municipalities and also the state governments spend their own money together with the money they received, because they became the managers of the policies. What we've seen is that when the municipal level started to be the owner of the health equipment and also the educational equipment, they started to put their own money not only the transfer they received from the federal level, but their own money to improve the equipment and to improve the quality of the equipment, because they had to be accountable for the results of the policy, because they had to face the citizens and to be accountable for what they were, the service they were offering for the population. So our experience is that not only giving municipalities the capacity to collect taxes, but giving them the possibility to implement the policy, the possibility to be accountable for the service, is a good way to decentralize the money. Not only the money, but the responsibility for the service, because you transfer also the responsibility and the accountability that is going to be next to population. I think that's it. That's it what I wanted to say. That's the main point I want to develop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a view from Brazil and a lot of kind of obvious parallels with South Africa's experience, I think, although I'm sure a lot of differences as well. Our third speaker is from Peru, and her name is María Antonieta Alva. She holds a master's degree in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School, and has been a civil servant in Peruvian national government for over a decade. She worked in the general departments of public investment and public budget. Like me, she has a degree from Kennedy School, and like me, she's the former head of the budget office in Peru. But unlike me, she went on to become a minister, a politician. So she's seen this thing from both angles. A minister of economy and finance, position she held until November 2020. And in that position, she led the design and implementation of the economic response to COVID-19. She currently works as Global Project Director at Acasus, a consulting firm that supports governments in Asia and Africa implementing health and education reforms. So over to you for the next 15 minutes, Ms. Alva.
Thank you very much. I will try to share my screen. Let me. Can you see my screen?
We see it, yes.
Okay, perfect. As most of my recommendations here will be as my experience of General Director of Budget in Peru. I won't talk a lot about, because our previous panelist has given really master classes in how the decentralization systems can be designed. I will really focus on in how we can, considering a decentralized country, how I think we can improve the service delivery, because at the end of the day, the motivation for decentralization is that subnational levels are closer to citizens and they are able to fulfill in a better shape their expectations and the delivery of services. So first, I will give you some context of Peru. Then I will go directly to two very interesting cases that we had in Peru to improve the service delivery for health services. And the last part will be some takeaways from this experience. So first, some context in Peru. Peru was really in a very difficult shape during the 18th. We had a major economic crisis, and we have also one of the bloodiest terrorist group, the Shining Path, that really had a lot of violence across the country. So after this huge crisis, we decided by the beginning of the 19th to implement economic reforms and build institutions to ensure macroeconomic stability. So we were really followers of very strict fiscal rules and discipline and compliance with the rules. We open our economy to trade, and we build institutions to generate financial stability. We saw the results of these reforms in the last decades, where Latin America where Peru was considered a star, considering main economic variables: GDP growth, public debt, fiscal deficit. And when I was minister, in fact, I went to New York several times to issue bonds, and we really had the confidence of the investors, and we issue bonds at very, very competitive interest rates. And we decided as a country by the early 2000s to implement a decentralization process that decentralized the service provision among the regional, provincial, and local governments. And in general, the view that we had is that reforms had concrete impact of citizens' well-being. We saw a huge economic growth that determined that poverty fell from 40% of the 2007 to 20% in 2019. Of course, COVID-19 has generated a lot of distortions. Now poverty is in 26%, but that is like some context on Peru. You have a country that was implementing economic reforms that could improve the quality of the living of citizens, but with limited impact. And I will talk a little bit about why I consider it was limited. To have an idea, we have a national level ministries that they are in charge of the administration of public assets, of course, the design of all the policy, national defense, and external security. Then we have 24 governors. These are, Peru is divided in 24 regions with 24 governors. They are elected. And I think that they basically, the main challenge they have is to provide healthcare and education. And then we have 1,600 municipalities. This is also a huge challenge because we have lots of municipalities, and in some cases we don't get enough economy of scale to, for example, provide services like cleaning of public roads, of the administration and management of garbage. So this is just like in a nutshell how the decentralization works. And then what is really important to consider is that all these economic reforms, of course, increase economic activity and thus the public budget. So what happened in Peru is amazing. In 20 years, the budget multiplied 5.2 times. So it was huge, the increase of budget. This is like an exercise I usually had to do. This is the public budget of 2020. This is before COVID also, because after COVID we had a lot of distortion. So the budget, this is in Peruvian soles. So the budget initially is approved in Congress. So you will see there a first amount of 177 billion soles. But when you take out all the responsibilities of the central government that are, for example, the budget for the Ministry of Defense, that you don't have that decentralized, the budget for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the budget for the police, when you take out that, and when you take out some centralized expenditure like pensions, the contingency reserve, you have at the end, in the first part, the subnational government only have 30%, but when you clean this and you get to this middle thing that is 120 billion soles, that is 43%, the proportion of the subnational governance. But during the year, you do a lot of transfers. So at the end, considering all the transfers, the budget is distributed 50-50, 50 in the national level and 50% in the subnational level. So this gives you an idea that the budget is very, at the end of the day, decentralized. But what is here the question? So we see that Peru was considered a Latin American star. The budget multiplied by 5.2 between 20s and 2019. But do we think that the citizens really experience and improve in the quality of the services they had? And sadly, the answer is no. So this is also a very important issue about not only it's important how we distribute the budget, but the quality of the expenditures is really, really important. You can implement lots of reforms to give more budget to the subnational level or even to the national level, but if that budget is not very well expended, that will not have a lot of impact on the citizens. So I will argue today about, depending on what is the design that we define for managing the budget, centralized or decentralized, what are the rules of allocation, what are the rules of who can have taxes, who can't have taxes. I will argue that it's very, very important that we focus in the quality of expenditures and in the quality of the delivery of public services. And I think that when I was Minister of Finance, for me, it was a shock to find that, for example, in Peru, we had less than 100 intensive care beds for 33 million people when we started with the COVID-19. So you see this economic star that the budget increased, but it was not capable of improving with this additional budget the everyday of the citizens. And I think that's how the health system was, we found the health system when COVID-19 hit was a very clear example of how economic growth, additional budget not necessarily drives to improving services for citizens. So even though this is sad news, I think how we move forward, considering also a context of a country that have low institutions capability, corruption, like in many Latin America. So when I think about, okay, the challenge is to improve the quality of the service delivery, depending on what is the architecture that we design to in our fiscal architecture. I think that I am a believer that instead of waiting for a big bang, I think that it's better to build incremental improvements. And here I'm going to present two cases that were really very relevant to make my case about how is it feasible to implement the service delivery using some tools. So here I will talk about two experiences: reduction of chronic malnutrition and a reduction of anemia. These two services are managed by subnational levels, and the main important things is that, and of course that you will see in the next slides, we had a very good results in reducing chronic malnutrition and in reducing anemia. What are like the guiding principles? First of all, in these two cases, building a national consensus on priorities was really, really relevant. We reduced chronic malnutrition, we reduced anemia when the country decided to do it. The second, and this is based on my experience as General Director of Budget, is budget for me. Probably I am biased because I was Director of Budget, but for me is one of the most powerful tools to shape the improvement of service delivery. And I am thinking about all the reforms, performance-based result reforms we implemented, and particularly strong involvement and commitment from the Ministry of Finance, particularly the General Director of Budget, is a game changer. When you want to implement a reform and you have this General Director of Budget that is buying this reform, that is a game changer. In this case, we are going to see that evidence-based policy with the right combination of capacity building, incentives, data, and accountability routines can have a huge impact on improving the quality of service delivery at the subnational level. This is what I'm going to argue in these two examples. And of course, these reforms needs a champion that is able to defeat the status quo and have the power to move structures. And we were lucky that in these two reforms, the Minister of Finance was a strong champion together, of course, with the Minister of Health. So first, I will talk about how we reduce chronic malnutrition. What happened, like the initial situation is that chronic malnutrition affected 28% of children. A child with chronic malnutrition will really have a lot of problems with their development, and we will never be able to compensate for that. In rural areas, it affected 45% of the children. Huancavelica, the poorest region in Peru, 6 out of 10 kids had anemia. And in 2007, Peru was one of the countries in Latin America with the highest incidence of chronic malnutrition. This probably applies to every country, but the impact of chronic malnutrition in inequality is huge. And here is a graph done by a very important doctor in Peru, by Luis Cordero, where you see how children, depending on their income quintile, they are born exactly with the same, like with the same conditions. And when you see how they move through their trimesters, how their growth rate really generates this major gap in children from a higher income, from a lower income. So this is in the first, and this is a problem with our unequal countries. So in the first months of your life, inequality is there and is shaping the rest of your life. And this graph is really huge. And this is a Peruvian case, but I am pretty sure that this applies everywhere. This picture is really very impactful. This is at the left, you can see the neuron of a malnourished infant. And then at the right, you can see the neuron of a normal infant. So chronic malnutrition really has dramatic effects on children. So what happened in Peru is in 2007, there was a huge movement across reducing chronic malnutrition. And what the Ministry of Finance did, in combination with the Ministry of Health, they presented the logical model, the theory of change, and I will present on the next slide, you will follow this better, of how this should be, of what was the theory of change, what was evidence telling us what is the good intervention to reduce chronic malnutrition. This was endorsed with the cabinet, and then the Congress approved the regulatory framework for implemented performance-based budgeting. And the first phase of implemented performance-based budgeting was addressing chronic malnutrition. So what it means, performance-based budget? It has many ways to be implemented, but in Peru, basically, you decide to tackle chronic malnutrition. So you design based on evidence, design a solid strategy to reduce chronic malnutrition. And then you give the budget, you use this evidence-based framework to allocate budget. This is quite controversial because once you decide what are the interventions that really contributes to reducing chronic malnutrition, you will realize that you will have to implement new interventions. But the difficult part of this is that you will need to stop delivering ineffective interventions. And as you can imagine, that has lots of resistance. Then, when you acknowledge that the budget is not unlimited, you have to decide your strategic bet. You need to concentrate budget on the most impactful interventions. And then once you define, and I will show you in the next slide what were the most impactful interventions for Peru, you define the allocation rules. So you do a budget bottom up, you define at the local, regional level, what is the amount of children to get vaccines, what is the amount of children that you should receive their mother counseling, and you do the budget bottom up. You earmark that budget to track the execution of the budget. And of course, we, as Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Health, we send teams across the country to help them build their capacity in the way they're going to formulate the budget and execute the budget. And then, of course, Peru, as you know, has jungle, has highlands, high coast, has a coast. You cannot, the cost structure for the jungle is not similar as the coast and at the highlands. So you also then need to customize interventions on different contexts. And it's very important that you also define indicators and build data system across the system. And of course, usually generate that data to assess implementation and the impact of the interventions. So we did this. This is the strategic bet that the Ministry of Finance and Health decided. We identify, and this is based on evidence, that chronic malnutrition was produced because of diarrhea and a low diet quality. And then we identify what are the good practices, hand washing, exclusive breastfeeding, and food preparation. And then we identify what are the strategic bets, what are the key interventions. That in our case was vaccinated rotavirus for all children below 12 months. And then to do these growth and development controls, every children will need to go to the health facility, and we're going to measure their growth. And in these visits to the health facility, the mothers will receive counseling in sessions about what is a good way to feed their infants, what is a good way, for example, to prepare foods that are strong in iron, and several things. So this was the key interventions. And we decided to allocate the budget bottom up. So we went to each region and identify how many children and how many mothers will need to receive this intervention. And this was really, really a breakthrough in the way Peru was doing the budget, because the budget was very, very inertial. You give plus 10% or less 10% of the last year. And here we change all the rules of allocation. And at the right side, you'll see in the light purple. At the left, you'll see the regions that have the prevalence of chronic malnutrition. In light purple, you will see how the budget was allocated before the reform, and in strong purple, how was allocated after the reform. So for example, if you see Huancavelica, that is one of, at the end, the poorest region in Peru, you will see how the budget really increased when we change the rules and we base this on this strategic bet. And what happened in Peru was really, really amazing. We were able to reduce chronic malnutrition from 28.5% when we started the intervention, and then in 2017 we reduced it to 30%. And it was huge. For example, in regions like Huancavelica, we reduced in 20 points. And the incredible thing is that in rural areas, that was the parts of the country that were really, really concerned more because of our inequality, and that the reduction was huge, like 17% reduction. The same, and this was across Andean regions, the highlands, or across the jungle. So this had a huge impact in equity as well. And the second case is reducing anemia. This case happened 10 years after we aimed to reduce chronic malnutrition. What was happening in Peru? Anemia, as you know, also has terrible impact in children and in their development. And what happened in Peru, and in this situation, I was the general director of budget, we were seeing that we were desperate because we were giving every year money to regions to reduce anemia, and the numbers were stagnated. You will see the red line there. 4 out of 10 children had anemia, and we were really, really very frustrated about this, because we were doing exactly what evidence recommended. So when you see evidence, you see that one of the main reasons for a child to have anemia is that they don't have iron, the iron that they require during the first 2 years of life. Until 6 months, they can have the iron for exclusively breastfeeding, but after 6 months, the breastfeeding will not be enough, and that the requirements will require a much more rich diet. And of course, you can imagine that in low-income families, there is not the possibility of give a rich diet on iron. So evidence tells that when you have this iron gap, what you need to do is to provide iron supplements. So in Peru, and this is also based on evidence, we started to buy what you see there is sulfato ferroso. It's an iron supplement. And studies tells you that they reduce the risk of anemia by 86%. So we were doing exactly what evidence was telling. But then we realized we were not tackling the right problem. We were obsessed about the supply, about buying el sulfato ferroso, buying the iron supplement, giving the iron supplement to health facilities. But we realized, when we start to analyze the problem, we thought that all health facilities in the country had the stock of iron supplement. We also saw that when the mothers came to their growth monitor sessions for their children, they were given regularly these iron supplements. And then we realized that the problem was on demand. That is, after the COVID-19 vaccination campaigns, we can also acknowledge that our many problems in health are now in demand. No? So we realized that at home, only 3 out of 10 mothers that received the iron supplement gave it to their children. So that was the problem here for us. And when we analyze why mothers were not giving the iron supplement, of course, there was a huge mistrust in the healthcare system. Of course, if you don't trust the healthcare system, what are you giving to your little kids? Something that they are giving you in the health facility. As you can imagine, there are not huge pharmaceuticals do not invest a lot in these products, so the taste, the appearance are horrible. I taste once this iron supplement and it's horrible, and it also had some side effects for children. And there was something very huge about behaviors and beliefs. In some communities, mothers thought that this was food for animals, for example. So we decided that the best way to get to our mothers and to do this intervention in the demand side was working with municipalities. We already had in place, as part of the performance-based budgeting that in Peru is huge. Like, it started in 2007 with this, the previous case with chronic malnutrition, but now it's 90% of the budget in Peru is done through result-based budget program. So we already had a municipal incentive program. Every year, the Ministry of Finance defines across $300 million in the annual budgets. And these programs define the municipal incentive programs. Local governments are grouped into clusters in order to have a fair competition, and a very rural municipality does not compete with San Isidro in Lima, that is probably the richest municipality. The government defines priorities, for example, reducing anemia, and targets are defined for each priority and cluster group. And the rules are as following. The local governments that reach the targets receive additional funding, and they can use it without any restriction, except for payroll increases, because that's part also of our fiscal rules. And across the process, the national governments provide technical assistance to local governments to build their capacity and reach the targets. Like, the win-win situation is that everybody reaches their targets because their targets are very relevant to citizens, and they will get additional money. So a lot of ministries, the sectoral ministries, are gather data and assess whether or not the local governments reach the targets. And some examples that we have, for example, of the goals, we have, for example, implementation of municipal solid waste management system. We have reduction of anemia. We have, during COVID-19, it was very relevant that they regulated the markets in order to prevent the contain of COVID-19. So this is our goals. And as I mentioned, we identify goals and we set targets for each cluster of municipalities. And of course, we provide technical assistance. And if they get the target, if they reach the target, they receive additional funds. So what we did, how we use this program, because local governments were closer to mothers, we implemented what they call home visits for counseling. So this will be mothers from the community that will go to the households, because there was this problem of mistrust on the health system. So mothers will go to the households and will provide counseling on what was important that their child receive the iron supplement. They will answer all their questions. So what we did is we give money to local governments for hiring all these promoters, what we call las promotoras. And then we gave them initial budget for this. And then we gave them additional budget in the incentive component of the incentive program, and give them additional money if they hire promoters, if they provide training to promoters, if the promoters did the effective visits to households. So there was a huge combination and a huge agreement between the national level and the subnational level in moving together towards an objective. And when we have seen the first year, we built the database, and then year after year, we have seen how these home visits are increasing. And our first impact evaluation for the first time, of course, then COVID came and everything was terrible. We reduced anemia, and we ran some impact evaluation, independent, of course. And the impact evaluation determined that when the intervention was correctly implemented, that means when the municipality hired on time the promotora was actively visiting the children, the anemia could be reduced by 50%. So what are my takeaways from this? So, and for this, as I mentioned at the beginning, I just focus on service delivery. So I think that with this Peru is an example of how, in spite of weak institutions, improvements in service delivery can be possible, and how can we, in a relative short time in a short period of time, we can improve the citizens' well-being through these performance-based tools. Our recommendation is to focus initially on small number of priorities. These allow you to crack the model, to know how this will work, and then to build enthusiasm in the reform. And then I need to acknowledge, of course, that result-based budget reforms create a lot of tensions. First, tensions within the government, the Ministry of Finance versus the Ministry of Health. These kind of reforms, as I mentioned previously, requires a lot of leadership from the Ministry of Finance, especially from the Budget Office, and this can generate some tensions. Then inside the Ministry of Finance, it can also generate some resistance, because you are changing the way they are doing always the budget that is like an inertial allocation with a result-based allocation. Something controversial is when you have to stop ineffective interventions, and in some cases, these interventions are rooted in social organization. For example, for chronic malnutrition, there was a lot of programs that will give social organizations money to provide lunches or food, and that was not effective. And something also very, very important to consider is that regional and local governments do not want prescriptions. So it's very important that once you decide your strategic bet or how are you going to intervene, it's important that you customize the interventions to local context. And I think the other recommendation is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There is massive evidence and on-the-shelf interventions when we want to reduce chronic malnutrition, when we want to increase learning outcomes. There are lots of interventions out there. It will be like the devil is in the details. It will be about how we think in the implementation phase. And data is very, very relevant for all of these, but I think that I do not recommend waiting for the most complex data system. You can basically start with an Excel spreadsheet to follow, and this is also a game changer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for these wonderful presentations. And I can see from my WhatsApp service that there are a lot of very excited people out there watching you. Just before we go into the questions that are coming through to me on WhatsApp, to say I think it's been three very different but very useful issues for South Africa. Indonesia, we heard from Kumba. Of course, Indonesia has the peculiarity of being an archipelago of islands, which I imagine makes the whole issue of centralization and decentralization particularly complex. And perhaps that's what I wanted to start to say. These issues of fiscal decentralization are very difficult. It's very difficult to have a conversation about them because there are so many complexities involved about how the tax system is organized, about how services are organized at different levels of provision, and so on and so there's a lot of contextual assumptions that we tend to make and overlook. So, but you spoke to us, Kumba, about the dynamics of proliferation and amalgamation. To what extent are municipalities amalgamating into bigger units, or decentralized subnational units are amalgamating? And the sense I got from you is that the direction of the system has been towards proliferation, or one might say fragmentation. And in South Africa, I think we've also had a long history of similar types of issues to some extent, involving demarcation and where. But my sense is that we've kind of we went through a phase of that, but we've kind of come to the end of that now, perhaps. Others might prove me wrong. But also you mentioned, Kumba, that there's limited local taxing powers. And so what you really have in Indonesia is a decentralization of spending without a decentralization of revenue powers. And I was wondering what difference that makes to accountability, and particularly bottom-up accountability, because my sense in South Africa is as well, because so much of our system is financed from the center, and because our tax system is so centralized, we constantly think of accountability as happening on a top-down basis. It's about the Auditor General or the Treasury or whatever center of government institution holding the lower levels of government accountable, but there's very little in empowering communities to hold their local governments accountable. Yeah. In Brazil, we saw the outlines of a complex system of redistribution through fiscal arrangements. And that is also very strongly what we have in South Africa. Almost all revenue is collected at the center and is redistributed through mathematical formulas that are even more complex and even more redistributive than what you have in Brazil. The problem for us, I think, has been over the last 20 years is that increasingly, particularly the municipal level, while it was hoped, again, that they would find their own sources of revenue, increasingly municipalities are increasingly dependent on transfers from the center. And in a sense, just maybe reflecting on my own experience on that when the pie is growing, as it was in Peru over a certain period, when the fiscus is growing and there's more and more resources that are being added into the fiscus, then the issues of how you divide the pie are not particularly controversial. And everybody's happy with redistribution. As soon as the fiscus starts coming under pressure and the whole pie starts shrinking, then everybody starts getting very upset about how the pie is divided and trying to divide the pie a different way instead of talking about how to grow the pie in total. So, and I thought also in the Brazilian case, the question of citizen accountability, you spoke about giving money, but also giving responsibility. And the question arises, given that the money's from the center, what really is the incentive? I think somebody asked the question on my WhatsApp line saying, why didn't they just take the money and use it for their own purposes? In the case of Peru, my reflection is that in South Africa, a lot of the input is about the power and effectiveness of vertical interventions. Vertical interventions in the healthcare sector in particular have a particular character. And in South Africa, we've also been very successful, extremely successful with similar types of vertical interventions. The one that comes to mind is the antiretroviral therapy program. That as soon as we had some problems in the beginning, ideological problems, but as soon as national government committed to rolling out the program, We were able to roll out a national antiretroviral program which clearly reduced child mortality and mother-to-child transmission and raised life expectancy in the country. But while we can wax lyrical about the successes of that program, it's also true that over the last 20 years, financing for the healthcare system as a whole, which is largely located at the provincial level in South Africa, has been increasingly squeezed, and we're increasingly seeing successful vertical interventions achieving very good outcomes, while the broader health system is eroded and facing, in many places, collapse. And also partly because of imbalances in the fiscal system, because, for instance, in South Africa, the center, the budget office and the center, as I say, is bound by very powerful formula that distribute the pie well, but things like, because we have a single integrated public service and wages are centrally bargained, and provinces that deliver healthcare have no influence over wages, we have a combination of very effective vertical programs and at the same time increasing fiscal stress, which in our own healthcare system emerges as hidden liabilities, accruals, and hidden deficits within the system, where provincial health departments are increasingly having to borrow from their suppliers to sustain their services. So let me, with those comments, maybe just ask in the same order that you spoke, maybe Kumba, starting with you, any reflections or on the other speakers or the kind of things that I've said?
Well, I think we all agree that we, in order to be able to make the fiscal decentralization is effective, you need to some sort of like the central government delegate some sort of like specific and important responsibility to subnational government through for like what I call is clear and strong constitutions. For example, India in the past, we can learn that India delegated specific power to central government, state government, and others concurrently. And this may also be the case with constitution in more like established democracies and institution of Western Europe's, whereby like authority is shared among different level of governments. So this cooperative approach involve policy formulations, implementation between central and subnational governments. But in addition to constitution, I think the effectiveness of fiscal decentralization or decentralization in general depends on, I think, the powers of subnational government to, levy taxes, for examples. Official, I can borrow the argument from oaths, where official of subnational governments will not have incentive to overspend, since they have authority to change both the priorities and size of subnational governments. So in the absence of subnational taxing authority, so I think unconditional intergovernmental fiscal transfer by central governments are also needed to ensure that subnational governments implement their priorities. So aside from revenue powers, I think a strong rule of law is required to guarantee that subnational government have discretion over expenditures, since they have, like Maria said, they have information and knowledge to match the priorities of the, to the preference of their citizens. But in terms of revenue expenditures, fiscally independent subnational government cannot run their function properly if they have a problem with what I call as administrative capacity. So all in all, I think good governance quality is vital for effective decentralization. So what I learned from like social or Latin American countries, for example, based on experiment in social investment funds, for example. Some studies show that number of Latin American countries perform well in redistribution and efficiency since they involve a high number of stakeholders within subnational governments. So their operation will become, transparent and correctly targeted to low-income groups. So I think, in my case, bottom-up approach is, can be a solution to in the context of redistribution schemes, as well as public goods and services that may also facilitate decentralization reform in developing countries to that aim this kind of objectives. That's for sure.
Cibele, or Cibele, I should say, in addition to the other discussions or to the issues I've raised, I see some questions particularly for you about the maybe to speak a little bit more about a decentralization model accompanied by the framework of co-responsibility. And maybe that's related to what Kumba has just been saying about conditional and unconditional grants. I'm not sure how that works out in the Brazilian system. Also, a question, maybe a very direct political question. How has this system of intergovernmental relations fared in the era of Bolsonaro? Has this led to more stress in the system? So over to you, because that's a whole plateful you've got there.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. Okay, let's start for the last one, Bolsonaro's. It's a very interesting question because intergovernmental relations are very dependent on the actors that are playing the game, and Bolsonaro has changed the game a lot. And the question is a very good question because Bolsonaro has changed the game completely. He changed the game from cooperation to conflict. And because I can give some examples. So we have a very cooperative intergovernmental game in the health system, as I mentioned. And he changed this a lot during pandemic. He tried to block the mandatory transferences to states and to municipalities during pandemic. They had to try to recover the resources through judiciary. He also tried. He didn't want to buy vaccine, and he tried to prevent governors from buying vaccine from other countries until one state developed the vaccine using a state laboratory, and then started vaccinating his own population, and then this is federalism, and then political autonomy, and then the president decided to buy Pfizer vaccine, and then so the federal government stopped to publish the number of deaths from COVID-19, and then the governors started to activate the cooperation from health with municipalities, and all the governors got together and started to publish the number of deaths alone by themselves and ignored the federal level. Okay, you want a conflict? we are going to do things by ourselves, and got together with municipalities and cooperated. So Bolsonaro decided for conflict. Now, 2 weeks ago, he proposed a constitutional amendment to limit the VAT, the state tax, to decrease the price of gas, because it's highly unpopular and he wants to run for president again. And governors completely disagreed, but he has majority in the Congress and he passed. So he's really for conflict, and now the cooperation really changed in Brazil. The other question about the question you asked me about the money in the money and the money and how do you spend the money, and the money being the center or being the municipalities. It's a very good question. In Brazil, we have, despite everything I mentioned about the decentralized taxes, we have about more than 50% of the revenues are in the federal level. We have only 18% of the revenues in the municipalities, and about 25% of the revenues stays with the states. So we have lots of responsibilities with the municipalities. So the citizens charge a lot from the majors, and they do not have much money to respond. So it's quite unfair. And we really needed reform. And so, talking about the grants, the majors are always looking for grants, for federal grants, because they need more money to do more, because citizens are always asking for more policies, because at the end of the day, citizens go for the majors. And federal level spends a lot on pensions in Brazil. They do not have much, I would say, much discretion to spend the money. They have to spend a lot of money on pensions and also in debit finance. Also, I had a question about encouraging administrative capacity, if decentralizing taxes is encouraging administrative capacity, or if it is increasing inequality. And I would say that in Brazil we had some kind of formula that helped us not to increase inequality. I would give an example. Inside the health system, we had a kind of transfer that would transfer money to municipality if the municipality opened a basic unit of health only by the number of inhabitants of the municipality. And the basic unit of health is a really basic system, is to have a nurse that could apply a vaccine, and that could help a mother to have basic attention to a baby. So it's not like the policy that the previous policy we had, that would give a transfer to a municipality if the municipality had an hospital, and would give a transfer linked to anything we do inside the hospital, because these would reinforce the inequality, because municipalities that did not have the capacity to have a hospital didn't receive any money. But then we reformulated the policy and gave money only to the municipality that could open basic assistance, that could had a nurse that would visit a mother that have, for example, a problem of a nutrition problem, or could have a problem of pregnancy problem, with a simple problem with the pregnancy. So we changed the policy not to reinforce inequality. And I think that was all the questions that were addressed to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's go over to, is it Tony? Is that the right thing? And you may have got some questions yourself on WhatsApp, but I was also particularly interested about what you had to say about stopping ineffective interventions. Is also the thing that we struggle with in South Africa, because we tend to pile programs on top of programs, and you never close. Programs are never die; they are only born. But over to you.
Yes. I think that to address this first question, I think that in my experience from government, I think that we don't communicate as we should. I think that communications is something that we lack a lot, and I think that part of when I was Minister of Finance in the COVID-19 crisis, I really need to, like, the lockdown of the economy, for example, was very difficult for citizens, and I really invest a lot of time in my old capacity building on communications, and I will go every week to the national media and really try to address the common citizen. But I think that this idea of so communication is something that is very important, and sometimes we don't value enough in government. The second is I think that we need to acknowledge that when we stop an ineffective interventions, there will be lots of lobbies and power groups, especially because some of these interventions have a lot of corruption networks, and I think that having the capacity to really taking a decision, and in spite of all the problems that your decision will come after, really being very strong about this initial decision, and being able to really tackle all these political problems. And sometimes I think it's difficult now with Twitter and social media, like something very small is then a political problem for the government. So yeah, but I think it's a challenge. That's why I mentioned that is something that we really need to be aware of. I have some questions about, in the examples that I described, who was in charge of execution. And the beauty of these interventions is that the subnational levels were in charge of the execution. In the case of chronic malnutrition, the regional level was the one in charge of providing the services. And in the case of anemia, it was the local government who was in charge of providing the home counseling visits. I think it was a very strong participation of the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Health, and obsession on building the capacity within the regional and local governments, and of course with generating accountability routines. I think it's very important. Sometimes we think that the job from an allocation of the budget, sometimes as Minister of Finance, you think that your job ends when the budget is allocated to the national government, but really the work ends when when the citizens receive the service. I had also some thoughts about what you mentioned on the payroll. In the case of Peru, the salaries are defined at the central level. There are specific career tracks for health, for doctors and for teachers. I think that this is very, very relevant because when you see the budget for health and education, probably 80% of the budget is payroll. So you really, really need to have a very consistent policy there, and of course, acknowledge that people will go to the rural areas if they receive incentives. So, for example, within the careers, you have additional allowances, risk allowances if you go to difficult areas. But I think in my experience, I think it makes a lot of sense to have a centralized definition of the salary scale. And we need to say this, no? In my experience, you have this huge source of corruption, like all what we called in Peru lavajato, these huge constructing companies that had a lot of corruption projects, but really the corruption in government is every day, and the micro corruption is in the payroll. I have seen this with my eyes. So I think it makes a lot of sense to have the adequate data systems where in the ideal world, parents know who are the teachers allocated to the schools of their children, and they know who are the teachers that are receiving a salary every month. So for corruption and things on the payroll, I really think that citizens can play a major role on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can come to an end, but just to repeat, I think what I said at the beginning, that I think in all of our countries, it's like our system, our constitutional system of fiscal decentralization emerged around the same time. I heard Kumba talking about 1999 in Indonesia being the key moment, and the constitution in Brazil of 1988, which of course the Brazilian transition happened contemporaneously with the South African transition, and in Peru as well, that period of phenomenal growth in the budget and in the economy. I'm sure partly a result of the commodity boom too, as well. In Brazil and South Africa, similar things happened. But there's a sense, certainly in South Africa, I think, that we are back to square one. Because while we had the most well-considered system of local government and fiscal decentralization that we could imagine at the time, as I say, 20 years later, 30 years later, it does look as though the local space is a space of fiscal crisis, and of operational crisis and of accountability crisis. And I suppose what's interesting is that unlike, the sense at national government that kind of we had this incident of state capture, which derailed us perhaps, but at the local government, I think the problems are in the design of the system. For one, we assumed that local governments were going to finance themselves by piggybacking on implicit subsidies on cheap fossil fuel. And so the local government crisis that we faced, fiscal crisis that we face today in South Africa, is very intimately tied in to the condition of darkness that we find ourselves in across the country due to load shedding. And so there's a need to reinvent the fiscal framework of local government, and within that to reconsider the whole of the system of fiscal decentralization, in my view. And that's something that we should certainly, as somebody else said from the audience, look to the Indonesias, the Brazils and the Perus and the others to learn lessons, and not only look to the Europes and the Americas, who have their own crisis of fiscal decentralization and their own. It would have been nice to link this discussion to presidentialism as well, given Bolsonaro and Trump and others. So thank you all very much. And we're going to ask Iva to conclude the day's session. Thank you very much, everybody, for this panel.
Yes, what a fabulous day, what a fabulous last session. The end note on the fiscal crisis, especially at local government level, I suppose I have to take some responsibility being part of the team in 1996 that drafted the white paper on local government. And it's that sense of complicity in the moment, of good faith in all sorts of things that have gone wrong, which I think needs to frame some of our conversations. A splendid day. One of the key terms that I'm taking away from today is this notion, which comes from Professor Lawrenson from Lagos, is this notion of self-provisioning. And it's increasingly a term that I've been thinking a lot about, in the sense that the joke apparently in Nigeria is that every household and every person essentially becomes their own local government, providing their own services. And it's a situation which we're increasingly faced in South Africa. So I'd like to frame the challenge going forward for South Africa as really of how we move away from self-provisioning, an increasing situation where we're responsible for all our own services. A remarkable day. Tomorrow we have got another remarkable day, starting with a session on asymmetric federalism. Louise Tillon from King's India Institute and Professor of Politics. Yamini Iyer, who's the CEO and President of the Centre for Policy Research in India, a public policy institute which hopefully, when GAP grows up, will resemble something like the CPR in India. And Ignacio Irazabal from the Director of Public Policy at the Pontifical Catholic University in Chile. And the topic is asymmetric federalism. It sounds very obscure, but essentially the idea of granting different powers to different subnational entities like provinces, depending on their performance. The day will end, again, with a terrific panel on the way forward. So digesting the day's conversations and how they will potentially inform a program of reform in South Africa. So we have Pindili Baleni, who is the Director General in the President's Office. We have Bosani Mhaweni, who is the Principal of the National School of Government in South Africa, joined by Barbara Nunberg, who used to head up the public sector reform program at the World Bank and developed all sorts of methodologies around in that regard, highly prestigious methodologies, and Ishraf Hussain, who was the former federal minister on civil service reform in Pakistan. So again, a fantastic the panel, both with theoretical but also practical experience to arrive, to draw conclusions of today's discussion or yesterday's discussion for a program of reform in South Africa. I thank you very, very much. The attendance of the conference is remarkable. We've had nearly 1,000 people over the last 2 days. So I'm very, very grateful for the participation. And it just shows that there's huge interest in South Africa and potentially around the world in the South African experience, but also in our drawing from global experiences. I thank you. I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. And on that note, I'll say goodbye. Ciao.